The cafe sat quietly at the edge of town, its wooden sign swaying gently in the morning breeze. The air was filled with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries. It wasn't a fancy place, just a small, cozy spot with mismatched chairs, a few framed photographs on the walls, and a corner shelf filled with well-worn books. Locals loved it for its simplicity, its calm, and the feeling that, for a little while, the outside world couldn't reach them here. Behind the counter stood John Mathers, a man who fit the cafe's unassuming charm. His hair was mostly gray, though streaks of silver caught the light when he moved. His face, weathered by time, carried the kind of quiet wisdom that made people feel at ease. Dressed in a flannel shirt and faded jeans, he looked like a retiree enjoying the slower pace of life. Every morning, John followed the same routine. He brewed coffee, arranged the pastries, and wiped down the tables with deliberate care. To anyone watching, he seemed like a man content with the quiet rhythm of his days. But beneath his calm exterior lay a story few could guess. Because John Mathers wasn't just a cafe owner. Once upon a time, long before this peaceful chapter of his life, John had been someone else entirely. His past wasn't filled with coffee beans and friendly chats, but with challenges that had tested his strength, his wits, and his very will to survive. He had walked paths that most would avoid, faced dangers that would make others crumble, and learned skills that few would ever need. His scars, some visible, many hidden, were proof of the life he'd lived. But John didn't dwell on those days. He had chosen this life deliberately, seeking peace and simplicity after years of chaos. Here, in this little cafe at the edge of town, he had found a sanctuary. He liked the quiet moments, the hum of the coffee machine, the soft chatter of customers, the way sunlight streamed through the windows in the late afternoon. Today started like any other. The regulars trickled in one by one. Mrs. Harper, a retired teacher, settled into her favorite corner with a crossword puzzle. A young couple shared a muffin at the window seat, their laughter soft and sweet. Even the postman stopped by for his usual black coffee, leaving a cheery "see you tomorrow" as he walked out the door. For John, it was just another day. The steady rhythm of the cafe gave him comfort, a sense of normalcy that he had learned never to take for granted. He had just finished restocking the sugar packets when he heard the low, distant rumble of engines. At first, it was faint, almost like a growl carried by the wind. But as the sound grew louder, it became impossible to ignore. The peaceful bubble of the cafe seemed to tremble as the noise approached. It wasn't the familiar hum of a passing car or the occasional truck that rolled through town. This was different. Motorcycles. John straightened, his hand pausing mid-wipe on the counter. He turned his head slightly, his ears attuned to the sound. Years of experience had taught him to pay attention to details like this. It wasn't just the noise, it was the way it carried a rough, almost aggressive roar that felt out of place in the quiet surroundings. Through the large front window, John saw them before they arrived. 5 motorcycles, their riders clad in leather jackets and dark helmets, roared down the street. They weren't from around here, that much was clear. In a town as small as this, everyone knew everyone, and these men were strangers. The cafe's door swung open with a force that made the bell above it jangle sharply. The riders stepped inside, their heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. The smell of motor oil and cigarettes followed them, clashing with the warm, inviting scent of the cafe. John's eyes flicked over the group quickly, taking in every detail. They were loud, rough, and carried an air of reckless confidence. One of them, the tallest, wore a jacket with a patch that read Reaper's MC. His sunglasses stayed on even as he stepped into the dim light of the cafe. Well, the tall one said, his voice loud enough to fill the small room. A cozy little place you've got here. The others laughed, their voices echoing off the walls. The young couple by the window exchanged uneasy glances, and Mrs. Harper quietly closed her crossword puzzle, her hands trembling slightly. John didn't react immediately. He finished wiping the counter, set the cloth aside, and looked up. His face was calm, his expression unreadable. "Welcome," he said simply. The leader of the group sauntered up to the counter, leaning his elbow on it with a casual arrogance. "What's on the menu, old man?" he asked, grinning in a way that wasn't friendly. John met his gaze without flinching. "Coffee, tea, pastries. Fresh today. No booze." One of the other riders chimed in, his voice laced with mock disappointment. "No," John replied evenly. "Just coffee and pastries." The group exchanged looks, their laughter low and rumbling. The leader leaned in closer, his grin widening. "You hear that, boys? No booze. What kind of man runs a place like this?" John didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was steady, unshakable. The tension in the room thickened. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, their unease palpable. But John remained calm, his hands resting lightly on the counter. The leader straightened, his grin fading slightly. He looked around the cafe, his eyes lingering on the small details: the old clock on the wall, the neatly arranged pastries, the quiet customers avoiding his gaze. "Nice place," he said finally, his tone almost mocking. "Real nice. Be a shame if something happened to it." Behind the counter, John's expression didn't change. But something in his eyes shifted just a flicker, quick and subtle. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but for those who did, it was unmistakable. It was the look of a man who had seen this kind of scene play out before. A man who knew exactly how it would end. The cafe had gone eerily quiet. The soft murmur of conversations and the clinking of cups had ceased, replaced by the steady hum of the refrigerators and the low shuffle of boots on the floor. The bikers spread out, their heavy jackets brushing against the chairs as they moved. One of them picked up a sugar jar, shaking it absently before setting it back down with a thud. John's focus remained on the man standing closest to him, the leader. The tall biker's grin hadn't entirely disappeared, but it had turned sharper, more predatory. His sunglasses reflected the soft glow of the cafe lights, masking his eyes but not the intent behind them. "You didn't answer me, old man," the leader said, his voice carrying a hint of challenge now. "What kind of man runs a place like this?" John didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he reached for a coffee pot, pouring a steady stream of dark liquid into a clean mug. "A man who enjoys peace," he said simply, sliding the mug toward the leader. The response was calm, almost casual, but it landed in the room like a pebble in still water, sending ripples of unease through everyone present. The leader stared at the mug, his lips twisting into a smirk. "Peace, huh?" he chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "That's cute." One of the other bikers, a shorter man with a scar running down the side of his face, snorted. "Yeah, cute," he echoed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He leaned against a table, crossing his arms as he watched the scene unfold. The young couple near the window seemed frozen in place, their coffee forgotten. The man's hand hovered protectively near the woman's, but neither of them dared to move. Mrs. Harper clutched her purse tightly, her knuckles white as she glanced nervously at the door. John took a step back from the counter, wiping his hands on a towel. His movements were slow, deliberate, and unbothered, as if the tension in the room didn't affect him. "If you're not here for coffee or pastries," he said, his voice steady, "then you're in the wrong place." The leader laughed again, louder this time. He picked up the mug of coffee, examining it like it was some kind of joke. "Oh, we're in the right place," he said, his tone turning darker. "We just thought maybe we'd teach you how to run a proper establishment. You know, one that welcomes paying customers like us." John's gaze didn't waver. "I welcome all customers. But I don't serve alcohol. It's not that kind of place." The leader's smirk vanished entirely now, replaced by a scowl. He set the mug down with a sharp clang, spilling coffee across the counter. The dark liquid spread out, dripping slowly onto the floor. "Maybe it's time you changed that policy," he said, his voice low and threatening. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. John stood his ground, his face unreadable. "Or maybe it's time you left," he said evenly. The shorter biker with the scar let out a low whistle. "You've got guts, old man," he said, shaking his head. "Too bad guts won't get you far with us." The leader took a step closer, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He was taller than John by a good few inches, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the counter. "You've got a real mouth on you," he said. "But you're forgetting something." John raised an eyebrow, waiting. "You're outnumbered," the leader continued, gesturing to his crew. "5 of us, 1 of you. You sure you want to keep talking like that?" For a moment, John didn't respond. He simply looked at the man in front of him, his calm blue eyes meeting the biker's glare. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension crackling like static in the air. Finally, John spoke, his voice as calm as ever. "Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The leader's face twisted into a sneer, but there was a flicker of something else there too, uncertainty, perhaps, or the faintest hint of unease. "Big talk for a guy running a coffee shop," the leader said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. John didn't respond. Instead, he reached for the cloth on the counter, wiping away the spilled coffee with a slow, deliberate motion. His movements were steady, almost maddeningly calm, as if he had all the time in the world. The leader's patience snapped. He slammed his hand down on the counter, the sound echoing through the cafe. "Listen here, old man," he growled. "You're gonna regret talking to me like that." John set the cloth aside, his gaze steady. "If you're looking for trouble," he said quietly, "you've come to the wrong place." The leader laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Oh, I think we're in exactly the right place," he said. One of the other bikers, a lanky man with tattoos snaking up his arms, stepped forward. "Let's show him, boss," he said, his voice eager. The leader raised a hand, silencing him. "Not yet," he said, his eyes still locked on John. "Let's give the old man one last chance to play nice." He leaned in closer, his face inches from John's. "So, what's it gonna be?" The cafe was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The other customers sat frozen in their seats, their eyes darting between John and the bikers. John didn't flinch. His voice was calm, steady, and unshakable. "I've already made my choice," he said. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, a smile crept across the leader's face, a cold, cruel smile that promised trouble. "Wrong answer," he said. The bikers stormed in like a storm front, their energy unsettling the quiet atmosphere of the cafe. The door slammed shut behind them with a jarring clang, the little bell above it ringing wildly as if in protest. 5 of them, clad in worn leather jackets bearing the name Reapers MC, swaggered into the room. Their presence was loud and abrasive, drowning out the soft clinking of cups and the gentle murmur of conversation that had filled the air moments ago. Their leader, a towering figure with a scruffy beard and dark sunglasses, stepped forward and made his way to the counter. His boots thudded against the wooden floor with every step, a deliberate reminder of his size and weight. Without warning, he slammed his fist down on the counter so hard that a nearby napkin holder rattled. "Hey, old man!" he barked, his voice rough and slurred. The smell of alcohol and cigarettes clung to him like a second skin. "We're thirsty. Get us some drinks, and don't keep us waiting." Behind the counter, John remained as still as a statue. His hands rested lightly on the edge of the counter, his face calm and unreadable. He lifted his gaze, his steady blue eyes locking onto the leader's. "We don't serve alcohol here," John said, his voice low and even. "Coffee and pastries only." The group erupted into laughter, the sound harsh and mocking. One of the bikers, a wiry man with tattoos crawling up his neck, grabbed a ceramic mug from a nearby table. He spun it between his fingers as if testing its weight, then slammed it back down with a grin. "What kind of man doesn't serve a drink to his guests?" The wiry biker sneered. John's expression didn't change. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "One who values his peace," he replied simply, his voice carrying an unmistakable firmness. The leader's grin faded, twisting into something far darker. He leaned in closer, his sunglasses reflecting the soft light of the cafe. "You hear that, boys?" he said, his tone laced with menace. "Grandpa thinks he's too good for us. Maybe we should teach him some respect." The tension in the room was palpable now, thick as the smell of motor oil that had followed the bikers inside. A couple sitting near the window exchanged uneasy glances before quietly gathering their things and slipping out the door. Another customer, an older man reading a newspaper, folded it quickly and made his way out without looking back. But John didn't move. He stood rooted behind the counter, his posture relaxed but purposeful. His hands remained still, his eyes never leaving the leader's face. "You're welcome to stay if you want coffee or pastries," John said, his voice calm but firm. "But if you're looking for something else, you're in the wrong place." The leader straightened, his broad shoulders rising and falling as he let out a harsh laugh. "The wrong place, huh?" he repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "I think you've got it backwards, old man. This is exactly the right place for us." The wiry biker with the tattoos took a step closer to the counter, picking up a sugar jar and shaking it lazily. "I don't think he gets it, boss," he said, his voice a mix of amusement and contempt. "Maybe we should help him understand." The leader smirked. "Yeah, maybe we should." He reached out and grabbed one of the ceramic mugs from the counter, turning it over in his hands before tossing it carelessly to the floor. It shattered with a sharp crack, the pieces scattering across the wood. The sound echoed through the cafe, silencing what little noise remained. John's gaze flicked down to the broken shards for a brief moment before returning to the leader's face. "You didn't need to do that," John said quietly. The leader shrugged, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Oops," he said, his tone mocking. "Guess I've got slippery fingers." One of the other bikers, a stocky man with a shaved head, chuckled and gave the leader a pat on the back. "Slippery fingers, huh? Maybe we all do." The leader's grin widened. "Yeah, maybe we all do." He reached for another mug, but before he could touch it, John's hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist with a grip that seemed impossibly strong for someone his age. The leader froze, his smirk faltering as he looked down at John's hand. The room seemed to hold its breath. "That's enough," John said, his voice low and steady. For a moment, nobody moved. The other bikers stared at the scene in front of them, their expressions a mix of surprise and disbelief. The leader yanked his arm back, stepping away from the counter. He rubbed his wrist, his face twisting into a scowl. "You've got guts, old man," he growled. "But you don't know who you're messing with." John let his hand fall back to his side, his expression as calm as ever. "No," he said quietly. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with." The leader's scowl deepened, and he took a step closer, his face inches from John's. "You've got a real attitude problem," he said, his voice a low growl. "And I think it's time we fixed it." The wiry biker with the tattoos moved closer, his hands twitching as if eager for action. The stocky man cracked his knuckles, a grin spreading across his face. The air in the cafe was electric now, charged with the unspoken threat of violence. The remaining customers sat frozen in their seats, their eyes darting toward the door as if considering whether they could make it out in time. But John didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He stood tall and steady, his eyes locked onto the leaders. "I think it's time you left," John said, his voice firm. The leader barked out a harsh laugh. "Or what?" he challenged. "What are you gonna do, huh?" John's gaze didn't waver. "I'm asking you nicely," he said. The leader smirked. "Yeah? And what if we don't feel like leaving?" For a long moment, the room was silent. Then John reached up, slowly unbuttoning the cuff of his flannel shirt and rolling it back to reveal a forearm crisscrossed with faded scars. He flexed his hand once, the movement deliberate, and a faint click echoed as his knuckles cracked. "You don't want to find out," John said quietly. The leader's smirk faltered, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. The leader's uncertainty was fleeting. His bravado returned as quickly as it had slipped, and he forced out another laugh, louder this time, as though trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. "Look at this guy," he said, turning to his crew with a mocking grin. "Rolling up his sleeves like he's about to do something. You think you scare us, old man?" The wiry biker chuckled nervously, though his eyes darted between John's face and his scarred forearm. The stocky one folded his arms and leaned back against a table, trying to appear unimpressed. John didn't answer. He simply finished rolling up his other sleeve, revealing more scars, some long and thin, others jagged, like the remnants of old battles. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, like someone who wasn't in any rush to prove a point. "Last chance," John said, his voice calm but with an edge that carried more weight than a shout ever could. The leader clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like John, a man he had written off as a harmless retiree. But something about John's calm demeanor was unsettling, like a predator that didn't need to roar to command respect. "You don't give the orders here," the leader snapped, his voice rising. He gestured to the others. "Teach him some manners." The wiry biker hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, clearly eager to prove himself. He cracked his knuckles, his grin returning as he squared up to John. "You've got a lot of nerve, old man," he sneered. "Let's see if you can back it up." John stood his ground, his arms at his sides, his posture relaxed but ready. His eyes never left the wiry biker, watching his every move with a focus that bordered on unnerving. The wiry biker lunged, his movements sloppy from a mix of overconfidence and alcohol. His fist arced toward John's face, fast but telegraphed. What happened next was almost too quick for the others to process. John shifted to the side with practiced ease, the punch missing him by a mile. Before the biker could recover, John grabbed his wrist, twisting it with just enough force to make the man yelp in pain. In one smooth motion, John stepped forward, guiding the biker's momentum and sending him stumbling into the counter. The biker hit it hard, the edge catching him in the ribs. He groaned and doubled over, clutching his side. The room fell silent again, the sound of the wiry biker's labored breathing filling the air. John released him and stepped back, his movements as calm as ever. He looked at the leader, his gaze steady. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he said. "But I won't let you hurt me or anyone else here." The leader's face turned red with anger. "You've got to be kidding me," he growled. "You're gonna regret that." The stocky biker pushed off the table, rolling his shoulders as he stepped forward. "My turn," he said, cracking his knuckles. The tension in the room climbed another notch. The young couple by the door, who had frozen in place during the commotion, slowly began edging toward the exit. Mrs. Harper clutched her purse tighter, her eyes wide with fear. John glanced at them, giving the slightest nod. "It's okay," he said quietly. "You can leave." The couple didn't need to be told twice. They slipped out the door, the bell jingling softly as it swung shut behind them. The stocky biker took a swing, aiming low and wide, clearly thinking his size would give him the upper hand. But John moved again, faster than anyone expected. He ducked under the blow and stepped to the side, his hand snapping out to tap the man's shoulder. It wasn't a hard strike, but it was precise, hitting a nerve that made the biker's arm go limp. The stocky man cursed, shaking out his arm as though trying to get feeling back into it. "What the hell?" he muttered, backing up a step. The leader's face twisted into a scowl. "Are you all useless?" he barked, glaring at his crew. The other two bikers, who had been lingering near the door, exchanged uncertain glances. They didn't look eager to jump in after seeing how effortlessly John had handled their friends. John took a deep breath, his voice calm but firm. "Walk away," he said. "This doesn't have to go any further." The leader let out a harsh laugh. "You think we're scared of you?" he snarled. "I think you're smart enough to know when you've lost," John replied evenly. The leader's face turned an even deeper shade of red. He stepped forward, pulling a knife from his jacket. The blade gleamed under the cafe lights, its edge wickedly sharp. "Let's see how tough you are now," he said, his voice a low growl. The other customers gasped, and Mrs. Harper let out a small cry, covering her mouth with her hands. John didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on the leader, his body perfectly still. But there was a shift in his demeanor, a subtle change that only those paying close attention would notice. His stance adjusted ever so slightly, his weight shifting to the balls of his feet, ready to move at a moment's notice. "You don't want to do this," John said, his voice low and steady. The leader smirked, clearly mistaking John's calm for fear. "Oh, I think I do," he said. He lunged, the knife flashing as it arced toward John. What happened next was a blur. John moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for a man his age. He sidestepped the lunge, his hand shooting out to grab the leader's wrist. With a twist and a sharp downward motion, he disarmed the man in a single fluid movement, the knife clattering to the floor. Before the leader could react, John shifted his grip, twisting the man's arm behind his back and forcing him down onto the counter. The leader let out a grunt of pain, his free hand slapping at the wood as he struggled to break free. "Enough," John said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that left no room for argument. The other bikers froze, their faces pale. None of them dared to move. "Take your friend," John continued, his eyes flicking to the wiry biker still clutching his ribs. "And leave." For a moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, the bikers began to back away. The wiry one shuffled toward the door, wincing with every step. The stocky one glared at John but didn't say a word as he followed. John released the leader, who stumbled back, clutching his arm. He shot John a venomous look but didn't make another move. Instead, he jerked his head toward the door. "Let's go," he snapped at his crew. The bikers filed out, their swagger gone, leaving the cafe eerily quiet once more. John stood there for a moment, his breathing steady, his gaze fixed on the door. Then he leaned down, picked up the knife, and placed it on the counter. Mrs. Harper finally found her voice. "John," she whispered, her voice trembling, "who are you?" John didn't answer right away. He rolled down his sleeves, buttoning the cuffs with slow, deliberate movements. "Just a man who wants to keep the peace," he said finally, his voice soft. The bikers paused, their loud bravado tempered by the quiet authority in John's voice. His words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. The leader straightened, trying to mask the flicker of doubt that flashed across his face. "You've got a big mouth for someone outnumbered," he said, forcing a smirk. "You think you're some kind of tough guy, huh? Maybe you used to be, but now..." He gestured at John's flannel shirt and weathered hands. "Now you're just an old man with a bad attitude." John's expression didn't change. He sipped his coffee again, the movement so deliberate it bordered on defiance. He set the cup down gently, the faint clink of porcelain breaking the tense silence. Age doesn't erase experience, John said calmly. But it sure does give you patience. The leader snorted, but his confidence didn't quite reach his eyes. He turned to one of the other bikers, a wiry man with a tattoo snaking up his neck. Take a look in the back. Maybe Grandpa here's hiding something good. The wiry man hesitated, glancing at John. But under the leader's glare, he nodded and slinked toward the back of the cafe. John didn't stop him. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. He didn't miss the subtle shift in Mrs. Harper's chair as she edged toward the door. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. Taking the cue, Mrs. Harper slipped out, clutching her purse tight. The bell above the door jingled softly, drawing the leader's attention for a brief moment. Guess she didn't want to stick around for the show, he said with a smirk. Smart lady, John replied. The leader's smirk faltered, replaced by a scowl. You think you're clever, don't you? John didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at the clock on the wall. The gesture seemed casual, but the subtle tension in his shoulders hinted at something more. The wiry biker returned from the back room, a frown on his face. Nothing but bags of beans and cleaning supplies, he muttered, clearly annoyed. Not much of a treasure trove, the leader sneered. He turned back to John. Looks like you're not hiding anything after all. Maybe we're wasting our time here. Maybe you are, John said evenly. The leader bristled at the calm reply, his fists clenching. You really think you can talk to us like that and get away with it? John met his glare without flinching. I think you've already overstayed your welcome. The tension in the room crackled like static. One of the bikers, a younger man with a nervous energy, shifted uncomfortably. Hey, boss, he said quietly, maybe we should just go. This place ain't worth it. The leader rounded on him, his anger flaring. You scared of this guy? He barked. He's nothing. Just some washed-up has-been pretending to be tough. But even as he spoke, his words lacked conviction. The cracks in his bravado were starting to show, and the other bikers noticed. You're right, John said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. I'm not what I used to be. But that doesn't mean I've forgotten. The room went still. Forgotten what? The leader asked, his tone laced with mockery, though his eyes betrayed unease. John's gaze grew distant for a moment, as if he were looking at something only he could see. Forgotten what it means to deal with men like you, he said softly. Men who think their strength comes from numbers, from fear, from bullying others. The younger biker shifted again, his discomfort growing. Boss, seriously, he muttered, let's just go. The leader ignored him, his pride refusing to let him back down. You're real full of yourself, aren't you? He snarled. You think you're some kind of hero? Some legend? John didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that made the room feel smaller. He adjusted the cuffs of his sleeves, his movements unhurried, almost casual. I think I'm someone who's seen enough of men like you to know how this ends, he said. The leader took a step back, then caught himself and scowled. You don't scare me, he snapped. John tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I'm not trying to scare you, he said. And then he took another step forward. The bikers tensed as John moved, their instincts screaming that something wasn't right. The wiry one edged closer to the door, his bravado slipping entirely. Boss, he said nervously, he's not normal. Shut up, the leader snapped, though his own confidence was starting to waver. John stopped a few feet away, his calm presence radiating a quiet authority. Let me make this simple, he said. You leave now, and we all go on with our day. No one gets hurt. But if you push this any further, I can't promise the same. The leader sneered, but the hesitation in his eyes betrayed him. Big talk, he said, though his voice lacked its earlier bite. John glanced at the knife still lying on the counter, then back at the leader. You can try to prove me wrong, he said. But ask yourself this, is it worth it? The room was silent, the weight of John's words settling over everyone. The younger biker shifted closer to the door, clearly ready to bolt. The wiry one followed, muttering something under his breath. The leader stood frozen, torn between his pride and the growing realization that he was outmatched. His fingers twitched, clenching and unclenching as he fought an internal battle. John watched him calmly, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to say anything more. The silence was louder than any threat. Finally, the leader let out a frustrated growl and turned toward the door. Let's go, he snapped. The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They filed out quickly, their earlier swagger gone. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the room dissolved. John watched the bikers retreat, the jangling of the cafe's doorbell marking their exit. But he didn't relax. His eyes lingered on the street outside, scanning for any signs of second thoughts. He'd seen men like them before, hot-headed, too stubborn to let go of a bruised ego without trying to patch it up with violence. Inside, the cafe was eerily quiet. The few remaining patrons sat frozen in their chairs, their breaths held as if exhaling might reignite the tension. Mrs. Harper peeked in through the window, her phone clutched tightly in her hands. She had clearly called someone, and judging by the flashing lights that began to reflect in the window, help was on its way. John shook his head slightly, more to himself than anyone else. Always an audience, he muttered under his breath. As he turned back to the counter, a slight tremor in his hands betrayed the calm exterior he'd projected. He reached for his coffee, but the familiar bitterness didn't settle him the way it usually did. Instead, it stirred memories he'd spent years burying beneath the routine of cafe life. Years ago, before the quiet mornings and the aroma of roasted beans, John Mathers had been someone else. He wasn't always the unassuming cafe owner in a small town. There was a time when his days had been filled with danger, strategy, and the weight of split-second decisions. He had worked in the shadows, in places where the stakes were life and death. His skill set wasn't learned in a kitchen or behind a counter, it was forged through years of training, years of survival. He'd left that life behind for good reason. Or so he thought. Are they gone? Mrs. Harper's voice broke into his thoughts, hesitant but firm. John turned, offering her a small smile. For now, he said. But just in case, you might want to head home for the day. She frowned. And leave you here alone? What if they come back? John chuckled softly. I'll manage. Her concern lingered, but the arrival of the flashing red and blue lights outside seemed to reassure her. She nodded reluctantly and began gathering her things. Outside, the bikers hadn't gone far. They loitered on their motorcycles a few blocks down, their loud laughter carrying in the still afternoon air. From the corner of the cafe's window, John could see them gesturing animatedly, their faces a mix of frustration and defiance. He could almost hear the conversation they were having. It wasn't over. Not for them. John, a voice called softly, pulling him back inside. It was Sam, one of his regulars, an older man who usually sat quietly in the corner with a newspaper. Today, however, Sam's paper remained folded on the table, his eyes sharp with worry. You sure about this? Sam asked. About what? John replied, though he knew exactly what Sam meant. About letting them walk away, Sam said, gesturing toward the street. Men like that, they don't just leave things alone. John sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I know. Sam leaned forward, lowering his voice. I've seen that look in your eye before, John. You're not just some retired cafe owner, Are you? John hesitated, the weight of his past pressing heavily against the present. What I was doesn't matter anymore, he said finally. What matters is keeping this place safe. Sam didn't look convinced, but he didn't push further. Instead, he nodded and settled back into his chair, his eyes flicking toward the window every so often. As the afternoon wore on, John prepared for the inevitable. He checked the locks on the back door, made a mental note of the nearest exits, and ensured that his emergency kit, one he hadn't needed to touch in years, was still tucked away beneath the counter. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he wasn't naive enough to think trouble wouldn't come looking for him. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cafe's floor, the bikers had returned. This time, they parked their motorcycles directly outside, their engines revving like a challenge. The leader dismounted first, his movements slow and deliberate. His companions followed suit, their earlier unease replaced with a grim determination. They weren't here to bluff anymore. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped inside, their presence filling the small space with an oppressive weight. Thought you'd seen the last of us, didn't you? The leader said, his tone mocking. John looked up from behind the counter, his expression unreadable. Not really, he said simply. The leader's smirk faltered at the calm reply. He had expected fear, or at least anger. But John's steady gaze unnerved him in a way he couldn't explain. You made us look stupid earlier, the leader said, his voice hardening. Now we're here to fix that. John stepped out from behind the counter, his movements slow and measured. He stopped a few feet away, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. You think this is the way to fix things? He asked, his tone mild but carrying an undercurrent of steel. The leader took a step closer, his fists clenched. You don't get to talk down to us, old man. John tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words. Then he smiled, a small, knowing smile that made the leader's bravado waver. Last chance, John said quietly. Leave now, and you can still walk away. The leader barked out a laugh, but it sounded forced. You're bluffing. John's smile faded, replaced by an expression so cold it sent a shiver through the room. Try me, he said. The leader lunged, his pride refusing to back down. But John moved faster than anyone expected. In one fluid motion, he sidestepped the attack, his hand shooting out to grab the leader's wrist. A quick twist sent the biker sprawling, his cry of pain echoing through the cafe. The other bikers froze, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of John's sudden display of skill. You have no idea who you're dealing with, John said, his voice calm but deadly. The leader scrambled to his feet, clutching his wrist. What the hell are you? He spat, his fear finally breaking through. Someone who warned you, John replied. The room was silent, the bikers' eyes darting between each other as they weighed their options. Finally, one of them muttered, Let's go, man. This ain't worth it. For a long moment, the leader hesitated. But the look in John's eyes, the cold, unflinching confidence of someone who had seen and survived more than they could imagine, made the decision for him. Fine, the leader growled. But this ain't over. It is, John said firmly. Unless you want it to end worse. One by one, the bikers filed out, their earlier bravado reduced to sullen silence. As the door closed behind them, John exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. The rising action has built to a pivotal moment, setting the stage for even deeper revelations and a confrontation that promises to tie John's past and present together in unexpected ways. Would you like the story to continue? The room froze. The name Special Forces hung in the air like a thunderclap. It was as though the air had been sucked out of the cafe, leaving only the sound of the faintly humming refrigerator and the nervous breathing of the bikers. The leader's bravado wavered, his smirk faltering for a brief moment before he steadied himself. Special Forces, huh? He sneered, though his voice lacked the confidence it had just moments ago. "That's supposed to scare us? We've dealt with tough guys before." John took a step forward, his movements deliberate and calm, like a predator assessing its prey. "You've dealt with tough guys," he said evenly, "but you haven't dealt with me." The leader's jaw tightened as John continued. "You've probably been in your fair share of bar fights. Intimidated some locals, pushed people around to feel powerful. But let me tell you something, you don't know what real power looks like. It's not about noise or numbers. It's about precision, discipline, and knowing how to end a fight before it even begins." The leader's hand twitched toward his pocket, but John noticed. He always noticed. "Careful," John warned, his voice like ice. "You don't want to make that mistake." The biker hesitated, his confidence faltering under John's unwavering stare. One of his men muttered, "Boss, maybe we should." "Shut up." The leader snapped, though the crack in his voice betrayed his fear. John took another step forward. He wasn't a large man, but the way he carried himself made him seem 10 feet tall. His presence filled the room, commanding attention and respect. "I gave you a chance," John said, his tone low and steady. "But you didn't listen. So now, you're going to learn the hard way." Before the leader could respond, John moved again, faster than anyone could anticipate. His hand shot out, grabbing the leader's wrist and twisting it just enough to make him drop the knife he had been reaching for. The blade clattered to the ground, and with a swift kick, John sent it skidding across the floor. The leader howled in pain, clutching his wrist. "You're gonna pay for this." He spat through gritted teeth. John's expression didn't change. "No, you're going to pay," he said, his voice as calm as ever. The remaining bikers looked at each other, their earlier bravado replaced with uncertainty. One of them made a half-hearted move toward John, but a single sharp glare stopped him in his tracks. "Smart," John said with a nod. As the bikers hesitated, John took a deep breath, his mind flashing back to a time long before he owned a cafe. Back then, he had been deployed in some of the most dangerous corners of the world. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a strategist, a protector, and sometimes, an avenger. But he had left that life behind for a reason. After years of violence, he wanted peace. He wanted to build something instead of destroying it. That's why he had opened the cafe, to create a place where people could feel safe, even if he had to fight to keep it that way. "I've seen men like you before," John said, his voice carrying the weight of his experience. "Bullies who think they can take whatever they want. You think strength is about scaring people, but you don't understand what real strength is." The leader sneered, though his eyes betrayed his fear. "You're just some washed-up old man. You think your past matters to us." John tilted his head slightly, a small, almost pitying smile tugging at his lips. "You should care about my past," he said quietly. "Because I've spent my entire life dealing with people who thought they were invincible. And they all ended up learning the same lesson." The leader's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "And what's that?" John stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "That they weren't." The bikers made their move, but it was sloppy, fueled by fear and desperation. John, however, was a master of controlled chaos. The first biker lunged at him, but John sidestepped effortlessly, using the man's momentum to send him crashing into a table. Another swung a chair, but John ducked and countered with a precise strike to the man's solar plexus, leaving him gasping for air. The remaining bikers hesitated, clearly outmatched. The leader, nursing his injured wrist, barked, "What are you waiting for? Get him!" But they didn't move. "You've already lost," John said, his voice calm but commanding. "Don't make it worse for yourselves." The leader, still too proud to admit defeat, snarled, "You think this is over? We'll be back. You can't scare us off forever." John picked up the fallen knife, examining it for a moment before tossing it onto the counter with a loud clink. His eyes locked onto the leaders. "If you come back," he said evenly, "you won't leave the same way you came in." The bikers began to back away, their earlier confidence shattered. One by one, they retreated, their leader the last to leave. As he reached the door, he turned back, his face twisted with anger and humiliation. "This isn't over," he growled. John didn't respond. He simply watched as they mounted their bikes and roared off into the night, their engines loud but their spirits clearly broken. As the noise faded into the distance, the cafe fell silent once more. The patrons who had stayed began to clap hesitantly, their relief palpable. "Guess that's one way to handle unruly customers," Sam quipped from his corner, a sly grin on his face. John allowed himself a small smile. "Just another day at the cafe," he said, though the tension in his shoulders hadn't fully eased. As the night wore on and the cafe emptied, John sat alone at one of the tables, a fresh cup of coffee in his hands. He stared out the window, his thoughts far away. He knew this wasn't the end. Men like the Reapers didn't take kindly to being humiliated. They would be back, and when they returned, they wouldn't make the same mistakes. But John wasn't afraid. He had faced worse in his lifetime, and he wasn't about to let a group of petty bullies undo the quiet life he had built. For now, the cafe was safe. And as long as he was around, it always would be. "Sometimes, the past catches up with you," he murmured to himself, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "But it doesn't mean you can't face it head on." And with that, he leaned back in his chair, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips, ready for whatever came next. The roar of the motorcycles faded into the night, leaving behind the remnants of a cafe-turned battleground. Chairs were overturned, sugar jars were spilled, and the faint scent of adrenaline still hung in the air. But the tension that had gripped the room moments earlier had dissipated, replaced by an odd sense of calm. John set the thermos back on the counter with practiced precision, his hands steady as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. He looked up at the scattered group of patrons, most of whom had either sought cover or stayed frozen in their seats during the chaos. "Well," he said with a faint smile, "looks like the place could use a little tidying up." The young man who had been hiding behind a table cautiously stepped forward. His eyes darted between the fallen chairs and the older man standing behind the counter. "That was something else," he stammered, his voice trembling. John shrugged, picking up an overturned chair and setting it upright. "They came looking for trouble. Trouble's not hard to find when you ask for it." Another customer, an older woman who had been clutching her purse tightly, stood as well. "You could have been hurt," she said, her voice filled with both awe and concern. John gave her a reassuring smile. "I've been through worse. Besides, this cafe's my home. I don't let bullies mess with my home." As the other patrons began to recover from the shock, they pitched in to help. One man swept up the broken glass from a sugar jar, while a young woman gathered the scattered chairs. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Fear gave way to camaraderie, as everyone worked together to restore the space. "You really scared them off," the young man said, his voice steadier now. "I don't think they'll be back." John paused, wiping down the counter. "Maybe. But men like that don't take kindly to losing face. They might come back, and if they do, we'll deal with it then." Just as things were settling down, the bell above the door jingled. A tall man in a sheriff's uniform stepped inside, his hand resting on the radio at his hip. He took one look at the scene and let out a low whistle. "John," the sheriff said, shaking his head. "Looks like you've been busy." "Sheriff Daniels," John replied with a nod. "Just a little disagreement. It's all sorted now." The sheriff's sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the overturned furniture and the expressions on the patrons' faces. "Disagreement, huh? That why I got 3 calls about a biker gang causing trouble." John gestured toward the door. They're gone. Didn't feel like staying for coffee. Sheriff Daniels crossed his arms, his expression skeptical but amused. You've got a knack for understatement. Want to tell me what really happened? One of the customers piped up before John could respond. He took them down, Sheriff. 5 bikers, and he handled them like it was nothing. The sheriff raised an eyebrow, turning back to John. That true? John shrugged, his smile modest. They weren't exactly disciplined. The sheriff let out a dry chuckle. You've always been modest, John. But you and I both know you're more than just a cafe owner. You think they'll come back? John's expression grew serious. Maybe. They didn't seem like the type to let things go. Sheriff Daniels nodded. All right. I'll keep an eye out for them. And if they do come back, you call me. Don't go playing the hero again. John's smile returned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. No promises, Sheriff. As the sheriff left, the cafe began to feel normal again, or as normal as it could after such an event. The patrons who had stayed started to trickle out, each offering their thanks or a word of encouragement. You've got a good thing here, John, the older woman said as she gathered her belongings. Don't let anyone take it away. I don't plan to, John replied with a nod. By the time the last customer left, the cafe was quiet once more. The chairs were back in place, the floors swept, and the coffee machine hummed softly in the background. John sat at one of the tables, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. His mind wandered back to the life he had left behind, the missions, the danger, the constant need to stay vigilant. He had walked away from that world for a reason, but it seemed like it had a way of finding him no matter where he went. The next morning, a local newspaper reporter showed up, eager to hear the story that had already started spreading around town. John, as always, kept his answers simple. They were looking for trouble, he said, pouring a cup of coffee for the young reporter. I just made sure they didn't find it here. But the reporter pressed on, asking about his past, his skills, and why he had chosen such a quiet life. John leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. Sometimes, you get tired of fighting. You want to build something instead of breaking it. This cafe? It's my way of doing that. The article ran the next day, its headline proclaiming, Quiet Cafe Owner Turns Tables on Notorious Biker Gang. The story spread quickly, and soon, the cafe saw an influx of new customers, locals who wanted to support John, and curious visitors who wanted to meet the man behind the story. But among the newcomers were familiar faces, men and women who had served alongside John in his old life. They didn't say much, just offered a nod of respect and a quiet assurance that if the Reapers came back, John wouldn't face them alone. Over the next few weeks, the cafe became a symbol of resilience for the town. The locals rallied around John, offering help and support in ways big and small. One morning, a group of young men showed up with a fresh coat of paint and new chairs, determined to fix up the cafe. Least we can do, one of them said, grinning. You've done enough for us. And as the days turned into weeks, the Reapers didn't return. Whether it was fear, respect, or a mix of both, they seemed to have learned their lesson. Late one evening, as John locked up for the night, he stood outside the cafe and looked up at the stars. The town was quiet, the air cool and crisp. He thought about the choices he had made, the life he had built, and the battles he had fought both in the past and in the present. And as he turned to head inside, he couldn't help but smile. Justice had been served, not with violence, but with strength, resolve, and the quiet determination to protect what mattered most. Because sometimes, the greatest victories aren't the loudest. They're the ones that leave a lasting peace. The cafe once again became the serene haven it was meant to be. Mornings brought the soft aroma of freshly brewed coffee, afternoons hummed with quiet conversation, and evenings settled into a tranquil calm as the sun dipped below the horizon. Yet, For those who had been there that fateful evening, the air carried a new weight, an unspoken story that seemed woven into the very walls of the place. John Mathers had returned to his routine as if nothing had happened. He poured coffee with the same steady hands, greeted customers with the same warm smile, and kept the cafe running as effortlessly as ever. But beneath the surface, something had shifted, not just for him, but for the people around him. The story of the bikers' confrontation spread far and wide, growing with each retelling. Some painted John as a hero, a lone protector standing against injustice. Others described him as a mysterious figure with a past they could only speculate about. Children whispered about him in awe, dubbing him the quiet warrior, while their parents shared knowing glances, recalling the calm confidence in his voice as he diffused chaos. But to John, the event wasn't a tale of heroics, it was a reminder of the life he had chosen to leave behind. As the days passed, he found himself reflecting on what had happened and why. Years ago, John had walked away from a world defined by conflict. It was a world that had shaped him, taught him to survive, and left its mark on him in ways that weren't always visible. For years, he had lived on the edge, constantly ready for the next challenge, the next threat. But with every mission completed, every victory won, the weight of that life had grown heavier. He hadn't left because he was tired of the fight. He had left because he wanted something more. The cafe had been his sanctuary, a place where he could rebuild his life with simplicity and purpose. Each cup of coffee he brewed, each kind word he shared, was his way of creating a space where people could feel safe, welcome, and whole. But peace, he had learned, wasn't always a quiet thing. Sometimes, it had to be earned. And sometimes, it had to be defended. The town, small as it was, rallied around the cafe in the days that followed the incident. Locals who had once taken the quiet spot for granted now treated it as a cherished part of their community. Strangers became friends over shared stories, and customers lingered a little longer, soaking in the warmth of a place that had come to mean so much more. Young people, inspired by John's example, began to carry themselves differently. They spoke up when they saw injustice, stood a little taller when faced with challenges, and treated others with a newfound respect. Even those who had left town years ago found their way back, drawn by the tale of the cafe and the man who had defended it. For many, the story was a reminder of the power of resilience, the strength of standing firm in the face of adversity, and the value of protecting what truly mattered. One rainy afternoon, a woman stopped by the cafe. She wasn't a local, but her face was familiar in a way John couldn't quite place. As he poured her coffee, she hesitated, then spoke softly. "You probably don't remember me," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "But years ago, you helped my brother. He was in a bad place, and you got him out. He always said you were the reason he turned his life around." John paused, searching her face. Slowly, a memory surfaced, a mission long ago, a young man caught in a web of danger and desperation. "I'm glad he's doing well," John said simply. The woman nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "He passed away last year, but before he did, he made me promise to find you. To thank you." John offered her a small, genuine smile. "You just did." As she left, John sat for a moment, his coffee forgotten. The memory of her brother, and so many others like him, reminded him of why he had fought, why he had sacrificed, and why he had ultimately chosen a different path. The cafe became more than just a business, it became a symbol of resilience, kindness, and quiet strength. People came not just for the coffee, but for the sense of belonging it offered. Over time, the story of the bikers faded into memory, replaced by countless other tales of connection and kindness that unfolded within the cafe's walls. But for those who remembered, the lesson was clear: strength isn't about how loudly you roar, it's about how firmly you stand, even when the odds seem stacked against you. Late one evening, as John sat by the window watching the rain patter against the glass, he allowed himself a rare moment of introspection. He thought about the choices he had made, the paths he had taken, and the life he had built. He knew he wasn't a perfect man. He carried his share of regrets, just like anyone else. But as he looked around the cafe, at the chairs neatly arranged, the faint hum of the coffee machine, and the soft glow of the lights, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Because in the end, it wasn't about the battles he had fought or the scars he had earned. It was about the people he had touched, the lives he had changed, and the quiet legacy he was leaving behind. Sometimes, the strongest people aren't the ones shouting the loudest or fighting the hardest. Sometimes, they're the ones who choose to build instead of destroy, to create instead of tear down, and to stand firm in their quiet convictions. John Mathers was one of those people. And for those who had the privilege of knowing him, the world seemed a little brighter because of it.